Yeah, we can even speak.
Can we? We are in a waiting room.
Hello.
Can we speak or not?
Yeah, we can. I can hear you.
Yes, but can we speak or we are heard by a
No,
plenary
I think
session?
there's only 4 people, participants. So the 4th one being the host so far.
Yeah, so
Yeah. I mean, it's plugged to the right channel. It's not. I don't know how numerous the audience is. Pleased to meet you, Elena.
It's pleased to meet you. We've seen each other.
Yes.
Or better, I have seen you before. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
Exactly, I think in the same spot actually during the negotiation, if I don't remember wrong, right?
God, yes. Great memories.
Well, it's good because they're memories. That's the good thing about them.
Yeah.
I'm going to run very fast and get just a cup of tea. I mean, some milk for my tea. I'll be right back.
Go ahead.
Hello and good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Just came back from the parallel skills workshop sessions, actually. So I think that's what people just finishing. So good morning, everyone, already. We're going to soon be starting today's plenary session of this year's ECMP. Yes, so let's just wait, I think 1 or 2 more minutes so people can join the room from the other virtual breakout rooms, basically, and then we're going to start. Okay, so I think we can start now while some people are still dropping in. But as you can see already here, we have a very interesting agenda for today's plenary session. So welcome everyone and good morning to the third day of this year's ECMP, which has the kind of topic taking into account the latest IPCC findings and what it means, especially for the European context, but also national policies and the shorter term. So I think we have a great panel from including several IPCC lead or candidate lead authors and people working more on the also policy domain. So very happy to chair this session. And we're going to start with Philip Tulkens, from the DG RTD, who is the head of the unit on climate and planetary boundaries. And very happy to have Philip start to kick off this day and of the ECMP workshop. So without further ado, Philip, the floor is yours. And yeah, so the idea is to have like around 15 minutes up to 20 maximum of presentations for each speaker. So we have 10 minutes or a bit more for discussion and questions and answers afterwards. So feel free to write in the meantime in the chat if you have any question or comment to the speaker, or we will also have the possibility in case to raise your question orally after the presentation. So yeah, Philip, the floor is yours, and I think now you should be able to share the screen. And
thank you, Johannes. But I may surprise you, but you will have the same image on the screen because I have no slides. I have a speech, which I will try to provide in a lively manner. And I hope this works even after three days of online conference. Compliments to you and all the colleagues present for being so patient. I know that it's difficult to attend online conference. I hope through this speech you will find it nevertheless interesting. So let's start. Indeed, I work in DG Research Innovation of the European Commission. So as you probably all know, what we do is to prepare the programming of research in the areas of climate, biodiversity, and environmental observation. Programming the research means deciding the priorities in the calls, securing the money, and preparing the opportunities that you researchers are seizing to develop the knowledge and inform the policy-making process. So in the climate area, what we do in the unit is to work on promote Earth system modeling research, work on mitigation pathways, climate adaptation and risk modeling. But also, as I said, we work also on biodiversity. So we try increasingly to integrate biodiversity modeling within the other modeling work that is being done. From this perspective, we are very highly interested in this conference, and we have already followed this conference since a few years. And congratulations for your work so far. We also had the EU delegation to the IPCC and to IPBES, which gives us a very good overview on the state of play in research in both communities, the climate and biodiversity. And we try really to integrate as much as possible the issues that need to be integrated and dealt with together. Today, I would like to talk about three things. One is the need for a more further integrated approach in modeling. The second thing is modeling of mitigation. And the third issue I will briefly discuss is adaptation modeling and their links to the energy system. The European Green Deal, as you know, is aiming at addressing multiple challenges at once: climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, resource depletion. And all these challenges are interconnected, and they must be addressed in a coherent way, promoting synergies while identifying and minimizing trade-offs. But for this, we need to overcome silos and adopt a more integrated, more systemic approach. This also applies to modeling, given the important role of modeling in decision support tools for evidence-based policymaking. Models are really at the core of all this process and are extremely important. To this end, I'm very pleased to see that the rebranding of the event that we are all attending to more explicitly embrace the climate dimension and dedicating a full day to better explore the implication of the latest IPCC work. This is all welcome. Energy and climate modeling are closely correlated, and in many ways they depend on inputs from each other. In terms of mitigation, first, the energy sector is absolutely central to the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals. This is clear to everyone here. In the EU, the production and use of energy in all economic sectors accounts for more than 75% 25% of EU greenhouse gas emissions. You all know that, but we need also to have this constantly in mind. This is why decarbonization of the sector has been among the key priorities for the EU for more than a decade, next to issues such as energy security, affordability, and market integration. The decarbonization objective remains the top priority of the EU in the current highly volatile geopolitical context, and despite short-term concerns about security, affordability of energy supply. In the light of the stark messages in the last IPCC assessment from the 6th cycle and the escalation of the climate crisis, it is indeed critical that we keep our eyes on long-term perspective. And this is what the EU is trying to achieve with the Repower EU package. The interconnection between climate and energy is best illustrated through integrated assessment models, which have become the key decision support tool for navigating the transition towards climate neutrality. This event is an excellent opportunity to recall how important these models are for the work of the IPCC, notably its Working Group 3 on mitigation, where 5 European models provided over 75% of the scenarios in the most recent AR6 assessment. This demonstrates the global leadership of the EU modeling community and something we can be all proud of, because many of these scenarios have been generated through EU-funded projects. I'm very pleased to see, for instance, the projects Navigate and Paris Reinforce that they have been involved in this conference and supporting it. There could be no better recognition of the policy relevance of projects' work than uptake in the IPCC, which is the ultimate authority on informing climate policies. It is therefore an excellent proof that it was money very well invested by EU funds for research and innovation. And I can confirm that we have every intention to continue our support to the integrated assessment modeling community in the forthcoming calls under Destination 1 of Cluster 5 of Horizon Europe. Because there are still many challenges that need to be overcome to improve the usefulness of integrated assessment models for the design of climate policy and for international climate diplomacy. We will continue to invest in this area that needs continuous development in the models and usage, of course, to produce scenarios and policy guidance. This includes notably better accounting for interdependence of climate, biodiversity, and human dimensions through improved integration of natural, social, and economic sciences in the modeling toolbox. We have invested a lot in this area of research through Horizon programs, and we will continue to support in the future. The next calls will be out end of this year, so stay tuned and have a look at the opportunities that you may wish to seize. But it's not only that energy matters for climate, it also goes the other way around. The changing climate matters for the energy sector and sets the boundaries for its transformation. This becomes increasingly visible as the pace of impacts accelerate. This year has broken many climate records. We continue to see catastrophic events unfolding. Many parts of the world are becoming unlivable, and our adaptive capacities are increasingly being stretched, not only in the developing world, but also increasingly in Europe. The Copernicus data system confirms that summer 2022 was Europe's hottest on record by substantial margin. Preliminary assessment by our JRC colleagues in the European Commission points to the conclusions that the last summer's drought could be the worst in at least 500 years. According to the latest update from the European Forest Fire Information System, 2022 is likely to become one of the worst, if not the worst year ever recorded in terms of hectares impacted by wildfires. And this is happening at 1.1 degree of warming on global average. But the recent IPCC assessments recall that even with rapid emission cuts, temperature will continue to rise until at least 2050 and lead to further extreme weather events. In the IPCC, 1.5 degrees warming is likely to be reached or exceeded in the early 2030s under all scenarios examined. By the WMO, the world faces a 50% chance of warming of 1.5 degrees by 2026. And of course, this has important consequences for the energy sector, both in its current fossil-dominated and future, and largely based on renewable and I will take some examples. Those include increased risk for hydropower production from changes in precipitation and water availability. Heat and water availability affects cooling of nuclear and power plants. You all know this. Extreme weather events such as heat waves and wildfires impact biomass production. Moving forward, changing weather patterns will also influence renewable generation and put physical assets under stress. Impact of supply chains also, such as the disruption of key infrastructure by extreme events. This is exactly what happened in Europe last summer, showing that we are not talking about a distant future. The heat and drought has reduced hydropower in Norway, threatened nuclear reactors in France, and crimped coal transport in Germany. In particular, the last one was striking in my view. All on top of Russian gas cuts. With regard to IPCC findings from Working Group 2, they confirm that these trends will continue. I take just a short extract. Cost for maintenance and reconstruction of energy infrastructure will increase with global warming level. The associated functional disruptions are projected to be substantial, particularly for infrastructure located on coast and on permafrost in cold regions. The EU mission on adaptation, I don't know if you heard about that. It's an initiative introduced in Horizon Europe, and I would encourage you to have a look at it. And other missions from what are called the Green Deal missions in the areas of ocean, with cities, on soil. Those will work on addressing these such issues on adaptation to climate change as part of its intervention area on protecting critical infrastructure. Dedicated calls in Horizon Europe have been launched, such as towards asset level modeling,
Philip, can you hear us? I think we lost your connection, maybe.
Yes, we could hear.
Philip, can you hear us? Okay, let's wait while he maybe reconnects. Yes, anyhow, I mean, we're getting close to the hour, so I think it's hopefully almost towards the end. So yeah, let's in the meantime, in any case, thanks a lot. I think there was already a lot of food for thought and comments on a wide range of topics, from the IPCC to social dimensions, the role of adaptation, biodiversity, and the links with energy, between energy and climate modeling. So I think a lot of great topics, and also great to hear and see that this the future funding and of scientific projects is continued in this direction. That's, I think, great message. So I don't know if you can hear us, Philip, but in any case, thanks a lot. And yeah, we can maybe have some questions, but maybe we're gonna just continue with the next speaker, so we can then join the questions after the next talk, or even at the very end of the session. We should have time. So okay, let's move on then to the next speaker, who directly talks to okay, or yes, I saw your colleague Katarzyna is here. So yeah, maybe we have, I don't know if there's any comment or question in the chat, so please put it there. Okay. or Katarzyna, I can also try to unmute you. Can you hear us?
No, because he's online, so he's in.
These online conferences don't come without any small glitch.
Left. Maybe the next speaker and then.
Yes, it seems.
Katarzyna, yes. Hi. Now
Okay, it took a moment. Let me see, because I have two screens, so I'm looking not in the right direction. But I think it's the voice what matters. Yes, unfortunately, it seems we lost Philip, but he was coming to an end. So maybe just concluding messages about the importance of stronger collaboration between the climate and energy modeling communities. I think this it's really a key message that both these communities, they depend on inputs on each other, and this conference is really a great opportunity to strengthen the collaboration as we move forward. And of course, this event will be continued in the future. The second point is that we see that in the pace of change, not only as regards the accelerating impact of climate change, but also the geopolitical consequences, there is also a lot of pressure on the acceleration of policy advice. So this is a message that the community, that the modeling community also needs to become more agile, to provide the policy advice at the time when it's needed to feed and steer the policy making process. So therefore, I think an important message for the community is to encourage you to monitor the Commission work program. The 2023 work program will be published later in October, to see what the key policy initiatives are, and that you mobilize, that this information informs your work. And that you can provide the advice at the right time. And for example, a very important initiative that the Commission will be working on is the 2040 climate target plan. As you know, we have a 2030, we have the long-term target of climate neutrality, but the 2040, the Commission has to put forward, and our colleagues in DG Klima are leading this exercise. And this work will happen mainly in 2023. There will be a public consultation, and since a lot of projects and large part of community is doing work that is highly of interest to this 2040 greenhouse gas emissions target, there will be important opportunities for the community to contribute. So keep an eye on this. And basically, with this, I wanted to conclude, and maybe a message also on transparency, that in this context, and also based on the learnings from COVID, there is a lot of importance on promoting the transparency in the modeling world. There is no room for secrecy in modeling for public policy. So we would really also like to encourage the move towards open source tools. And it's not only about open code, but also about transparency on assumptions and outputs, and promoting access for all stakeholders free of charge. And because there is also there are different levels of transparency, and there is a difference between transparency and translucidity. So we would also, it's very important, it's very close to our heart in DG Research and Innovation. It's linked to open science, so we would also like to encourage it very much. So that's all from my side, and I will hang around a little bit, so in case there are questions, I can also try to step in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katarzyna, working on it. Yeah, I think very points well taken, and I've seen in many presentations, including skill workshops, a lot in this direction, at least in the integration of climate and energy part, and yeah. it's also great to see this. I think it's a great call to link to the active ongoing initiatives and also calls for seeing the focus of the Commission in these topics. So thanks a lot. And I think, yeah, we can discuss maybe at the end of this session once we hear a bit more also about the IPCC, especially in what it means for future works in the integration of climate, especially in energy modeling. So thanks a lot, Philippe and Katarzyna. Okay, so let's then move on to the second speaker. Go a bit more into the climate impact domain. And we're very happy that we are going to have 3 speakers who have been actively participated in the IPCC's work, including the latest AR6 report. And we're going to start with Elena Verdolini, who is a professor at the University of Brescia. She's also a researcher here at the AEE, and she has been also a lead author of the AR6. And she also has an ERC project on her own, which is focusing on the interactions between decarbonization and digitalization, another technology kind of important field, I think. And so we're very happy that she accepted to speak. And Elena, I hope you can hear us. So,
I hope you can also hear me. If you could confirm, that would be nice. And let me share my screen and pull up my presentation. Can you see it in the right mode? And I hope you don't see anything on the screen. But
yes, it's all clear. Thank
Perfect. You. Okay. Well, Johannes, thank you for asking me to give this talk. It's really nice to be here, and I think the topic, as was already said, of the conference is really a key one. It really speaks to the help and the support that models can give to climate policy moving forward. So let me just go directly into the presentation, because I know we're tight on time. And so my presentation is about 2 things. It's going to talk about 2 things. The first one is going to talk and explain a little bit how the IPCC assessment works in general for the whole report, not necessarily only linked to models. And the second part is going to give you very briefly some key messages, some of which are going to also be picked up by later speakers, I believe. So it's going to be a sort of introduction to the topic. So in terms of the working group 3 contribution of the IPCC, I hope this is, probably this is common knowledge, but let's just set the basis. What is an assessment of the IPCC? So the IPCC, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It has 3 working groups, which basically are dedicated to providing the world with objective scientific information on 3 different topics. The first one, working group 1, reviews evidence related to the physical science basis of climate change, of anthropogenic climate change. The second one talks about impacts and focuses on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, whereas the third one looks at mitigation of climate change. And the IPCC is the UN body dedicated to informing the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which in and of itself aims to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate systems. So over its lifetime, the IPCC was founded in 1988, and over its lifetime, the IPCC has produced 6 assessment reports and several special reports, the most famous of which is probably the report on 1.5 degrees. The 6 assessment reports, the difference between an assessment report and the special reports is that in an assessment report, the working groups work separately. You get 3 volumes, 1 for each working group, and the special reports, the 3 groups come together and they produce 1 single, let's say, publication on a very specific topic. So in terms of how the assessment work, I think it's interesting to understand what's behind an IPCC volume or each of the IPCC volumes. So the methods that we use for assessment are basically start from figuring out what evidence exists on the several topics, on the several questions that are raised in the context of the UNFCCC and questions that are posed to IPCC authors through the outline of the report that we're tasked with writing. And then starting from this evidence, we evaluate the type of evidence, the quality, the quantity, and the consistency of evidence. So in an IPCC report, you can find basically 3 types of information. And this you see on the green part, on the gray part on the bottom. The IPCC report can be talking about evidence and agreement. And this happens when the evidence is there, but it's not very easy to classify it in terms of confidence level. So this applies more to, let's say, questions that have to do with less certain results and answer to the literature. On the other hand, if we have enough evidence, if there is enough literature, we can present confidence intervals, I mean confidence statements, right, that you see here. We can classify the evidence that we collect in basically in a matrix. On one axis there is evidence, on the second one there is agreement, and you can think of different combination of these things, and we translate that into basically a confidence statement that can go from very high confidence into very low confidence. Now, if we have enough information and enough data, we can also go all the way to providing likelihoods within the report. And when we provide the likelihood, there is a very specific way in which we use the wording. You can see it in the last box to the very right of the slide. When the IPCC writes in the report virtually certain, it means that we are there is an outcome probability across all the evidence that we collected of 99 to 100%, more likely than, I mean, likely, it means between 66% and 100%, and so on and so forth. It's a scale, basically, right? So when you read an IPCC report and you find these different words, for instance, medium evidence, medium agreement, or medium confidence, or likelihood statements, then this is what we mean when we use the specific words. So I'm going to focus on the working group 3 of the IPCC, so mitigation of climate change. And that, just to give you an idea of the effort that goes into one of these reports, 278 authors were appointed to write the report. They were supported by the precious help of 354 contributing authors, which are called in to provide input on specific questions in which they are experts. The authors come from 65 countries, about 40% of which are developing and the rest developed. There is about a third of women within the authors team, and these people have gone through, in working group 3 alone, about 18,000 scientific papers. And they have gone through the process that I just described in the previous slide. What is interesting, I think, about the IPCC way of working is that this process lasts 4 years, because you basically write the report, you send it out for comments, both to governments and the general public. You receive comments, and then you have to reply to each of these single comments, explaining whether you take it into account or not. And in this cycle, we've gone through about 59,000 comments, review comments that we've received. Very briefly, the organization of the IPCC Working Group 3 report starts from an introduction and framing. Then you have chapters 2 to 5 that talk about emission trends, drivers, and present the result on pathways that you're going to see later. Then you have 7 chapters, which are basically sectoral and go in depth into a specific sector. Chapter 16 to 13 focus on 3 specific issues, which are policies, finance, and technology. And these are considered means of implementation within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is why the focus on this specific topic. Chapter 17 closes the report, providing also consideration regarding to sustainable development. Okay, so in terms of main messages, I have I'm going to drop 6 main messages onto you. And some of these I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in. Some of these are going to be picked up by Detlef later on in the presentation. So when the Working Group 1 report came out in August 2021, Antonio Guterres, as you all know, declared that the report was a code red for humanity. So basically what we have to do, as the report says, is if we have to avoid climate change impacts, further worsening of the climate change, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to achieve climate neutrality. This entails, however, important changes major changes, drastic changes in our economies, and these changes are not coming about if policy intervention is not put into place. And why is this? Well, it is because emissions differ over countries and over time, both in terms of absolute values and per capita values. You can think about, there is a big debate whether you should be counting emissions from a production-based accounting or consumption-based accounting. So are you going to be supporting the cost of mitigation based on what you produce or what you consume, and the two are not equal? Decarbonization policy several times can have negative impacts on other socioeconomic outcomes, especially on low-income households and specific sectors, both for labor and small and medium-sized enterprises, or also large one. Ability to decarbonize is influenced by other megatrends, such as, for instance, digitalization, and trade-offs are present between choosing to mitigate climate change and choosing to pursue other development goals. So very briefly, what are the main messages that emerged from the summary of policymakers of the report? The report is very long, so there are a lot of messages, but we pulled these 6 ones up in order to share them. So the first message is that so far there has been limited progress. Emissions are still rising. We're not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And here is an historic graph showing you how emissions are rising over time up to 2019. However, it must be recognized that there is increased evidence of climate action. Some countries have achieved a steady decrease in emission consistent with limiting global warming to 2 degrees. And very importantly, zero emission targets are being adopted bottom up. So from cities, regions, subnational governments, and so on and so forth, right? There has also been a significant rise in climate change mitigation legislation and litigation as well. Second main messages, we have the IPCC report basically assesses a world of future possibility. What you see here, and you will see in a later presentation also, it's the scenarios that are assessed within the reports and which are classified in different classes depending of the temperature that they are believed to they will be associated with at the end in 2100. Okay, and so all these scenarios basically give you possible ways in which our societies are going to move forward, and this depends on what we're going to do. In order to interpret this world of possibilities, the report in and of itself focuses on IMPs, illustrative mitigation pathways. These are different families of possible future scenarios that are taken into account and that are shown and commented in order to make it easier for people to explain to understand this complex and very rich set of scenarios that we have. And you can see the names of these different scenarios over here. We go from a scenario that's called current policy to one called moderate action, and then we have the mitigation scenarios, right, where we have global strengthening, negative emission, low energy demand, renewable or sustainable pathways. What these scenarios differ in is they differ in the way in which greenhouse gas emissions move over time, and namely they differ in terms of policies that are implemented to make it such that these emission pathways go a certain way. And you will hear a lot more about this later. Specifically on this slide will be picked up later. There are specific timings by which you need to peak and reduce emissions if you want to make a specific climate target by 2100, right? And temperature will stabilize only when we reach net zero. So depending on when you reach net zero, temperature will be at a certain level and it will stabilize for the years forward with the potential to decrease then over time by the end of the centuries and over that. So of this, what is interesting about the IMPs, and you will hear later, is that each of them has an underlying different energy system. And all of these different energy systems may be compatible, that are presented here, are compatible with stabilizing, with the climate change stabilization. And so later on, you will hear a little bit more in depth what are the differences between these different IMP scenarios. The fourth result that I think it's important that emerges from the IPCC SPM is that the mitigation cost potential from different options is very varied. However, half of the emission reductions needed by 2030 at the moment could be achieved with a cost of less than $100 per ton of CO2. So on the graph to the right, what you see is the length of the bar, is the potential mitigation that that specific technology can provide, and the color of the bar, it explains to you how costly that would be. A red bar means that that option is very costly right now. A blue bar, it means that that option is basically lower than what you have as technology deployed right now. So you see that there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of technology responses, but you also see that there is a lot of blue in this graph, which means that some technologies are ready to hit the market. And you will hear more focus on innovation and technology in a later talk as well. The silver lining of this specific, let's say, result is that basically what emerges from the report is that the global, it emerges, the fact that emerges is that there are technological options and that potentially there are some mitigation pathways in which the cost can be supported, right? Even though they may need to a slight reduction in GDP over time. Overall, the global economic benefits of limiting global warming to 2 degrees are reported to exceed economic cost of mitigation in much of the assessed literature. What really matters here is how we manage the transition, how we manage the negative impact of these policies on specific sectors and on specific people and on specific countries. And this is where policy becomes very important. The report also talks about financing, and it shows that we need to close a significant investment gap in order to fully achieve, if we have and if we intend to fully address the issue of climate change. The current financial flows are between 3 and 6 times lower than the levels needed by 2030 to limit global warming to either 1.5 or to 2. However, there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close these investment gaps. The challenge is greater for developing countries, but in many cases, what is more challenging for everybody is actually reroute financing and divest from fossil fuels into newer technologies. The sixth result is that policies have proven effective. Regulatory and economic instruments have already proven effective in doing 2 things. On the one hand, reducing emission, and in the second, and on the other hand, in promoting innovation. Policy packages and economy-wide packages can be designed in such a way as to achieve systematic change. And however, ambition and effective mitigation requires coordination across governments and different societies. Yet, let me say that in many cases, challenges remain, and policy portfolios needs to be designed in such a way as to account not only for climate change, but also for broader development challenges and trade-offs. The report shows you in all the different sectoral chapters that there are options available right now in energy, in every sector that can at least halve emission by 2030. I will just briefly conclude by saying that the biggest progress so far has been done in the energy system. Great progress over the last 2 decades. If you only look at the cost of producing electricity with photovoltaics and onshore wind, you will see that differently from the last assessment report, AR5, we can now observe costs that are competitive with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are represented by the gray bar, and the cost here is the cost of photovoltaics. Of course, this is the global cost, so regional differences still persist. So what we need to do now is to capitalize on these changes. There are some clear no regrets options, the no-brainers that we could do to address climate change. One is electrification, the second one is energy efficiency, and the third one also mentioned is that of sufficiency, meaning slightly reducing demand, reducing demand in such a way as not to overuse our resources. There are, however, important sector-specific challenges for industry. For instance, industry faces great challenges towards the decarbonization because not all processes can be electrified. We will need alternative fuels in specific sectors, such as, for instance, air travel. And there is a big potential role for demand-side measure, meaning having people behave differently in order to conserve energy energy and be more efficient. However, we need the capacity, the infrastructure and the resources to do this. And in certain countries, there are still significant challenges in terms of energy poverties. So basically, the report, the main message from the report that was lifted up was the fact that the evidence provided in this assessment is clear. The time for action is now. We have many technologies that can be deployed, and we have the urgency of doing so. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope I haven't gone too much over time.
No, not at all. Perfectly in time. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for a very fast ride through what is a very big report. So that's fair enough. And I think a lot of interesting insights. So thanks for that. As you already alluded to, we have two other speakers from especially the IPCC on the related topics. So they might clarify some things that might be questions. I already saw one or two questions in the chat that Detlef has been answering already. So that is maybe something to wait a bit for after his presentation. So unless there are any specific questions or someone wants to raise a hand, please write it in the chat. Otherwise, maybe we have the next two presentations and then we can have an all IPCC Q&A session after that. Okay. I think that's
sorry for running very fast through it, but as you know, it's 1,000 pages report and 100+ pages SPM. So the challenge you set me up for was actually a big one. So I hope I conveyed at least some clear messages. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks a lot, Elena. I think, yes, I think everyone can then pick what he or she is mostly interested in, and also question that in the Q&A or in the chat. So please do that, and then we will collect the questions after the next two presentations. So with that, let's move to the next speaker, who is Laura Diaz-Anado. She is a professor for climate change policy at Cambridge University, and she has extensive experience in the field of climate policy evaluation, innovation. Has also been a lead author at AR6, and we're very happy that she found time in the busy period of university restarting, etc. So thanks a lot for being with us today. And yes, I think you can now hopefully share your screen, and I think it's starting. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Can you see it?
Now, yes.
Great.
You can just click on present, I think. Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Johannes and team, for the invitation to present. It's really a pleasure to contribute to this important meeting. I really appreciated the presentation by Philip Tulkens and by Elena just before me. In a sense, Elena left it at a good place. Of course, this was by design. So what I'll try to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to summarize some of the key messages and some of the key findings from a chapter of the IPCC Working Group 3 report on mitigation. So both Elena and I were actually lead authors in the chapter on technology innovation and transfer, which is chapter 16. So I will divide the presentation into two parts. In the first part, I will talk about some of the key messages, findings, figures from this chapter. So going in a little bit more detail on what we found in the chapter in terms of the impact of different policies, governance, and issues on different innovation metrics. And then I'll move on to a very quick overview of different areas of research that I made in terms of where the empirical research is going. And of course, it is my strong belief that it's really important to connect the empirical research on innovation in climate technologies with the modeling community. So hopefully this will provide some ideas for future research or questions. So I'll start, of course, with this figure, which you've all seen. This is actually not in chapter 16 from the IPCC. This is at the very beginning. And again, what we're seeing in all of these scenarios that Elena mentioned they all involve some type of innovation. And here, of course, innovation involves not just research, but it goes all the way to technology deployment and technology obsolescence decay, right? So what we all know is that there are some energy technologies specifically where there's a lot of research, and we have a long history of costs coming down. In this figure that, again, Elena also showed, we see that specifically since 2010, when the data was for the last assessment report, we've seen rapid cost reductions in photovoltaics, offshore wind, and battery vehicles. The other thing that we've seen is that alongside, and of course, partly a cause of these cost reductions, was the fast deployment. So we have a bidirectional relationship between deployment and cost reduction. So we've seen that again since the year 2000.
Sorry, Laura. Sorry, can you hear me?
Since 2010, the share of electricity. Yes. Can you hear me?
I think there's a small audio issue. I don't know. Maybe it can help if you turn the video off. That might because.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you. I'll try that. Do let me know if it's.
Yeah.
I had to connect from a different place because of my start of the year teaching commitment. So let me see. Okay, is this better, Johannes?
Yeah, I think for now it's
a little better. Do let me know, and I'll slow down. So these are some of the things we're familiar with, and again here on batteries, for example, we see that.
I'm sorry, I think it got actually
2020, the share of the passenger vehicle fleet, that is electric vehicles, reached 1%, but of course in terms of sales. Hello?
Yes, now it got okay again. Yeah,
is it better now, or are we still having it?
It's okay.
Okay, so let me then I'll kind of go through this. So this is of course we know about this story, and what we try to do in chapter 16 is to dig a little bit deeper into what explains these sorts of trajectories in innovation. So what are the main objectives that we set ourselves and that we had in the charter for chapter 16, which is titled Innovation, Technology Development and Transfer. Systems of innovation contribute to technology development, adoption, diffusion, and deployment of mitigation and adaptation technologies. And here the brackets to some extent give you a sense that we had less information that we could draw upon in our review of the literature for adaptation, but that's not because it's not part of the objective. The second area was on assessing how public policies contribute to strengthen national innovation systems and the key characteristics of these policies, assessing the role of international cooperation.
Sorry, I think we lost.
And discussing the development and adoption and diffusion of these technologies in this broader context of system. Is this not working?
Now it's it's okay. Let's sorry for that. So.
No, I am sorry. This is surprising. I guess maybe with having
now it's okay. Yeah, who knows?
Okay. So this piece number 4 here in the slide is that one of the other kind of newer things in the report in this chapter was trying to put the innovation challenge and evolution in the broader context of sustainable development. And again, as I think Elena mentioned, there are sectoral chapters that go in detail studying different technology and mitigation options. Here it's a more integrative chapter. So one thing that again many of you are familiar with is of course the idea that technology innovation is not linear and it is shaped by policy. And I think it's this latter point in the title of the slide that is really important and really comes out in the review of the literature in this latest IPCC. what you can see here is a figure that shows, again, it's very hard to represent the nonlinear nature of innovation. So you should see this all in reality with arrows going in both ways. But what this figure here is meant to show is this connection between, innovation stages and different technology trajectories, because often you have, in many cases, you may have an incumbent technology or a technology that is establishing itself, and then a novel technology that is trying to find its way here. This is what we're calling the potential future disruptor. And what we're seeing is that we have this integration between the stages of innovation and the socio-technical transitions literature. So for example, here in this figure, we have some of these comments and sections on niche markets, incumbents, continual innovation. We have a much better understanding of the relationship between different technological trajectories and what it takes for one technology, let's say, to overcome the other. And this is why in the right-hand side of the figure, we have these public policy instruments supporting innovation. So the chapter 16, does quite a lot of work developing and presenting a typology of policy instruments. And one important connection here within the IPCC is the connection between chapter 13 on national policies, which looks at a wide set of policies and focuses on environmental outcomes. And then also chapter 16, which is really looking at a smaller set of policies that is where we have evidence that they have had an impact, mostly positive, as you will see, on technological innovation outcomes. And here we have this economic and financial policy instrument category on the first gray rectangle, and then the regulatory and soft instruments categories. And as was previously mentioned by Elena, what we see here is that it's really the coordination and the systemic view of these various policies that have made a difference. And let me go into this in a little bit more detail. You cannot see this, so I'll zoom in a second, but I'm putting this up again. This is also a table in chapter 16. And what we're doing here was with the literature, we looked at the technology innovation systems literature. So this is where we have the function on the left-hand side. We have the 7 functions of innovation. And then on the columns, we have a set of indicators, input indicators, output indicators, outcome indicators, actors and policies that are associated in the literature to that particular function of innovation. So let me zoom in a second just so that you see, but I think this might be a useful map for this community in terms of seeing where is the literature, in terms of how we measure, how we track different functions of the technology innovation system, and and how different policies and different actors have been identified as important in playing a role. So this is the zooming in part, and again, it's not a super high quality table, but the key message here is that when you look at the functions, the first one here is knowledge development, and here we have input indicators, and we have higher education investments. They're very commonly used by, I think, many of the in this community are in the investments, number of researchers, number of projects. When you look at output indicators, you have scientific publications, highly cited publications, patents, etc. So this table is really bringing together a wide range of literature, including the economics of innovation literature, the transitions, sustainability literature, and also, for that matter, the political science and sociology literature. So hopefully this will be useful for the community. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the vision on what is innovation, how we understand it, what are important components, I'll get down to a particular section in chapter 16 that talks about the characteristics of effective public policies, and then I'll summarize the literature before moving on to some of the recent empirical developments outside of the IPCC. So the first thing is that in the analysis we found in the chapter that a combination of scaled up investments in terms of research, development, and demonstration with demand pull interventions, with some of these market creation opportunities, can achieve and have achieved faster technology unit cost reductions and scale up. So it's been this combination, sometimes at the same point in time, sometimes a little bit sequentially, have led to some of the fast technology improvements. The second one is that when it comes to assessments, policy evaluations of the effectiveness of different policy instruments on some of these innovation indicators, what the chapter found in the literature is that public research and development funding and innovation procurements have shown to be valuable for fostering innovation. So they've basically always had a positive impact. And then the other thing that I would say that the chapter shows is that we've seen historically that public energy R&D funding, so this is mostly energy, the data that we were able to get, was shaped by crisis, in particular, of course, the oil crisis of the 70s, and this may give some lessons about what we might see now in response to the current invasion of Ukraine. We also found that policy instruments not usually primarily aimed at innovation. Again, that doesn't mean that they're not also aimed at innovation, but in many cases it's about achieving renewable deployment, reducing emissions. And here we are talking about feed-in tariffs, renewable auctions, emissions trading schemes, various taxes. In some cases, the research, in some cases it was older research, but in some cases we saw no impact on innovation. Again, that doesn't mean that there were no positive impacts in other areas, and in many other cases there was a positive impact. And again, one other thing that came out is that some specific designs of environmental taxation can, at least in the short to medium term, result in negative distributional outcomes. So again, what this chapter shows is that while we look at the specific impact, what the literature says about the impact of some of these policies on innovation, we also look at the impact on other distributional and competitiveness outcomes. And finally, when it comes to this question about covering the whole world, of course, the chapter identified that there was a scarcity of literature covering the impact of different policies and their impact on innovation outcomes in developing countries. But we also found that the development priorities in particular locations, the context and the technologies being assessed really matter in terms of understanding well, effectiveness and the future. And again, this is what I mentioned in terms of how the community, we need to do better at trying to get insights that are directly relevant for developing countries. So before moving on to some of these new pieces of literature, I'll show a couple of the additional figures in chapter 16. One is again a summary of some of the literature of this policy evaluation literature that merely groups the number of evaluations looking at different policy instruments. Here they go from left to right, R&D investments, procurements, emission trading schemes, carbon taxes, and it just shows the number of evaluations and the extent to which those evaluations suggest that the impact of a particular policy instrument as innovation has been negligible in gray, negative, and this means negative in terms of perhaps the more novel technologies, or nothing is in this particular set of papers. It's not that they were having a negative impact on innovation on all technologies. When we see some of the orange, it's mainly looking at, well, maybe it favored the incumbent technology as opposed to the new technologies such as maybe onshore wind versus offshore wind, or novel solar designs versus the silicon designs. So we see that, for example, things like emissions trading schemes in some of the areas we weren't able to find. Some of the evaluations showed a negligible impact on innovation. Again, in many cases, this is looking at older papers, and maybe this will change in the future. And kind of closing a little bit this idea that this chapter really tried to merge the economics of innovation as well as the more sustainability transitions and innovation systems literature. We have this figure, which is actually in a cross-chapter box. Box 12, many of you will know that there are these cross-chapter boxes. In chapter 16, we have one on digitalization, which I think Elena already alluded to, as well as this chapter box. And this, again, might be a helpful figure showing these kind of stages of socio-technical transitions: emergence, early adoption, diffusion, stabilization, as well as some of the processes and public policies that have been identified in the literature. Now I'm going to, again, I think I have 5 minutes, Johannes. I've changed the format to put the blue bar in the top just to show a little bit that these are things that are not in the IPCC report figures. So these are just, I think, areas of research that I think are going to be useful for the next cycle and for this community, especially, given the the global stocktake exercise that is being done across the world, of course, COP27 and the current situation. So we are getting better at understanding the uncertainty around the future trajectories of energy technologies. This is a paper that I worked on with Elena and others, where we looked at different modes of considering or trying to understand the cost of different energy technologies. So what we saw is that experts, I'll just give you the summary here. It would take me too long to explain this, but this is just to give you a figure. We saw that model forecasts were more likely to include observed values so that they were more accurate in the period of time we were looking at for the technologies for which we were able to look at this. And this is, by the way, work that was funded by the European Commission. So I just want to mention this to Philip and others. We also saw that, however, during this period, all methods were underestimating the pace of technological change. So again, this is one of the few good news in climate and energy research, that we may be getting close to a socioeconomic tipping point where some of the policy and market and consumer forces that are going in the right direction for climate. And then finally, that 2030 forecasts are, again, continue to be more optimistic with models than with experts in general. Where else do we see research going? Well, we're starting to see more research that is not just looking at technologies as a single piece, like a wind turbine or a solar panel, but that is also looking up the value chain. So we're starting to get data, and this paper is looking up the value chain of energy of suppliers of wind components. So here we were able to look at the location of manufacturing and also in another piece of R&D for different components in wind. And what we see is that there are characteristics of components that make it more or less likely that there will be domestic manufacturing happening in different places. In other words, that when we're trying to get this win-win of improved economic growth and competitiveness and innovation in energy technologies, we are beginning to understand what it is about a particular technology and the productive capacity of a country that makes it more likely that you'll be able to get both. So again, we're seeing less internationalization, less domestic production for more complex components in wind. We also have more detailed analysis on what's happening with the not so usual technologies. So we have some what I consider exciting work, understanding progress in things like solid state lighting, both in terms of improvements in efficiency and cost. And we see the role that, for example, bans in incandescent light bulbs had in the deployment and huge economies of scale in solid state lighting. So again, I think we're moving beyond the usual suspects in terms of technologies. We also are beginning to understand using machine learning on patents, and again, looking at both equipment manufacturers, the OEM and the suppliers. Where is the innovation, the long-term risky innovation happening in terms of the EU, European manufacturers and China? And we're actually seeing that, contrary to what some other articles and management literature had indicated, which suggested that China wouldn't be doing risky long-term investments, they actually are. So if you look here, the only thing I will say is that this dotted line shows patents on long-term wind component technologies in China. So we're not seeing that China is slowing down or going for less risky R&D in terms of the patent record. And then again, this is something that I mentioned already, but we are beginning to get this picture of the both distributional and competitiveness impacts of technologies. So orange is bad. But again, we have a lot of blue suggesting that there are ways, as is mentioned in both the overall summary of the IPCC, the executive summary, and chapter 16, to do this properly. And I think 1 minute, the only last thing I will say in terms of where we see the literature going, we're also beginning to get a sense of institutions and governance for managing these investments in research and demonstrations. So here, this new paper, we see we both kind of count the new innovation institutions in energy that have been created in 8 major economies, including India and China. We also have budgets for energy R&D going back to 2000 in India and China, and we're beginning to see the contours of what makes for successful energy innovation institutions. So going down to this level, not just of how much you spend, but how you spend it and what's effective. And the last plug is that we came out with this report that is bringing some of this evidence on how, what are we learning overall from the past 30 years of renewable energy and electrification policies. And what we see is that some of the common principles that have been used for policy making were not actually what inspired some of the big successes that we saw. We saw that for the energy transition, there's a set of principles that we need to look at, such as, for example, that technology choices must be made. Policies cannot just be technology neutral. So I encourage you all to look at this link for this policy making, and we have 10 case studies. This one is on the investments that led to the cost of capital reductions in Uganda in renewables from 15% to 9% in 2 years. So we're getting, again, going along with some of the things that the two previous presentations mentioned, we're going down to this project level detailed knowledge on things like financing costs, technology costs, and component costs, and the impact of policies. So this is offshore wind, again, another example, offshore wind in the UK. And let me just conclude with the summary. What are the key themes from the IPCC and recent research about modeling for the innovation? Well, first of all, that we have much more information about the impact of public policies in policy areas and contexts, but there are a lot of gaps. About the pace and geography of innovation, uncertainty and time horizons, about trade and global value chains, institutions, governance and their impact, and of course, finance. Thank you very much to everyone, and apologies for the poor quality of the audio.
Thanks a lot, Laura. No, in the end, it was perfectly fine. So once we discussed it, somehow they listened at the IT department. And it was very nice to hear, actually. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for very concise and at the same time broad overview of, especially I think focusing on innovation was really important, and also the role of policies and policy evaluation. Innovation was actually found last year as one of the key issues that scientific evidence is still missing. So I think all this work that you referred to is really very relevant, also including for policymakers. And maybe we can have a couple of questions, as there are 2 or 3 in the chat regarding to your talk, before then having the more broad IPCC discussion. One is by Katarzyna on the different policies, instruments that you showed, what you meant by voluntary approaches. If there were offsets, or what kind of are these, because they have this apparently very positive impact on innovation.
Yes, Ashel, thank you for the question. Yeah, this was mainly firm commitments to do some, so this was not about offsets. The literature on offsets, as I'm sure Katarina is mentioning, is quite atrocious in terms of the impact on actual emissions reductions and the extent to which there is additionality. So this was mainly looking at firms saying, okay, we're going to improve efficiency, reduce our own emissions, and basically the indicators there. So I'm glad you asked the question, and this is explained in the actual chapter. The indicators there was more on reports as opposed to actual emissions reduction. This is saying, well, when they adopted these approaches, then surveys showing the adoption of new technologies showed that firms that had made these voluntary commitments to reduce emissions adopted more low carbon technologies. But there's not that much literature showing that these, increased adoption or increased commitments are actually leading to emissions reduction. So this was purely on innovation in terms of new projects, new technologies on the ground. When you look more broadly at something that was outside the remit of this chapter, which was looking at, which again, I've had students over the years doing, there's much less evidence that these voluntary approaches are leading to actual improvements in environmental outcomes. And when we do see these, they are due to regulation or the threat of regulation.
Right, good point. I think that clarifies that. Another point on the innovation research that you showed is from Juha Kiviluoma, who's I think working on a new project on different technologies, energy system modeling. Can this research, the one that you showed on innovation, be used to decide, let's say, what technologies should be financed in, or what technologies are, let's say, ready for scaling up, which are more in a kind of niche or early R&D phase, or which should also be maybe, let's say, stopped investing in, because that's of course a big question from a funding perspective.
Thank you, Juha, and it's great to hear from you after so many years. So we do say, I think there are some things that can be said. I think what the literature shows, and this is partly discussed in the IPCC, partly in other literature, and it's definitely in this 10 principles report that we released 2 weeks ago that I mentioned, that there is of course value in having flexible research that can be aimed at tackling risky projects, but where there's a high payoff, right? So I think there is value in having institutional approaches, institutes that allow researchers to very quickly go into something new, hire somebody exciting, demonstrate a project. So without curtailing some of these kind of bottom-up organic areas, there is research that is beginning to show that when it comes to making bets for early deployment in particular, or demonstrations a little less, but early deployment, that some of the data on previous cost reductions is the best indication that we have so far about the pace at which costs might come down. So we discussed this in this technology principle number 1 in the report, where some of the emerging things, again, I would say these are tentative findings. There's much more work that we're doing, including in another EU-funded project, to try to understand not just how previous experience is linked to the pace of cost reductions, but also how technology complexity, modularity, and other metrics might be associated with this. But there is this literature that is referred to in the IPCC and in this report that suggests that some of these more modular technologies, where you can very quickly experiment, where you have components that are linked to each other, may be better bets in terms of cost reductions. That doesn't mean that for decarbonizing some areas, we might not have to go for lumpy technologies, but I do think that we're beginning to get some empirical evidence that helps, I guess, increase the probability that some of these larger early deployment investments might lead to improvements. But with anything, we should be humble, right, about what the experience over the past 30 years says. About the next years, we see that there are structural changes. So one of the key features of both the IPCC research and other work is that governments need to adopt this monitoring, tracking, and adaptation approach to make sure that we learn as we go along.
Thanks. Yes, I think it's really a good example of and a very relevant piece of really evident policy questions for which this research can be very interesting and important to decide on the technologies, let's say, potential. Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Laura, again for your time and really greatly valued insights. So yeah, I know that you have to also leave soon for an appointment, so thanks for the time, really great appreciated. And we now move on to the third speaker of the IPCC, who is well, from the IPCC authors team, who is Detlef van Woeren, which I probably don't have to introduce to many of you. He's professor at the University of Utrecht and also senior researcher at PBL, whose name I can really still not pronounce, but it's basically the Netherlands Environmental Agency. And yeah, he's been coordinating lead authors in several IPCC reports, including worked a lot on biodiversity, for instance, that was mentioned at the very beginning of this session, and also lead author in the AR6, and focused a lot on the contribution of modeling, especially in developing scenarios, but modeling pathways and things also like the SSP framework. He had a key role, and so we're very happy to hear your insights. I probably assume you have some presentation, but also we can do old school. And if so, yeah, please share your screen. And thanks a lot for the accepting invitation to present here. We can already see it. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
And
Thank you.
am I sharing the screen in the right way?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I will be talking about scenario analysis and the role of models in the AR6 working group 3 contribution. Please note that here the word global model pathways is on the screen. I'll come back to that in a second. So Ski was the chair of working group 3, and this is a citation where he indicates that the integrated assessment models constitute about 6% of the report's contents. It's about 25% of the summary of policymakers, and it was the best part. It was the largest part of the press coverage. And so IAMs apparently play a major role, and especially when the information is summarized, some of the information from the IAMs becomes even more prominent. That's really also true if you look historically. This is a paper by Lisette van Beek, where she is looking into the role of the models, the energy system models or the IAMs in the reports, and and subsequently, actually, you see that the role of scenario analysis is increasing in the IPC reports. We also looked actually into the total literature, and you can see that the volume of IAM research is strongly increasing, but not as a percentage of total climate literature. The total climate literature itself is also increasing rapidly. And then there's this point about global model pathways. So one indication why, another indication that actually this research is important is that it was discussed quite heavily during the approval session of the IPC report. And we originally used the more normal term scenarios. But because countries actually, the scenarios have consequences, countries worry or have opinions about the scenarios. And in the end, the whole word scenarios was replaced in the summary by the word global model pathway, being a slightly less threatening. The word that global is in there, so it's not about specific countries. The word models is in there, so it's not about necessarily the real world. And so it's pathways, it's alternative options. And so countries apparently found it important enough to make it a slightly less dangerous for them. Yeah, and that I'm just citing another great scholar, Mr. Spiderman. If we are important, with great power comes great responsibility, and I come back to that later. Now, so there are many projects here in Europe and in other parts of the world that create scenarios. I just listed a few, and the scenarios that we're looking at can actually be classified in 4 different categories. First of all, we have these goal-seeking scenarios that look into how to get to 1.5 or 2 degrees. We have the second category of scenarios where we look into existing policies, like the current implemented policies of the NDCs. A third set of scenarios that we often look into are these improved policy scenarios, for instance, assuming that certain good practice policies are implemented in different parts of the world. And the fourth, yeah, that's the basic category of the baselines. And that creates a very wide set of scenarios. And that is what IPC had to deal with. We asked the community to submit scenarios into the scenario database, and a total of 2,266 scenarios was submitted into the database. And obviously, we had to apply some quality criteria, such as at least the data needed to be consistent with historic trends. Some of the scenarios that were submitted were older and did not hold up against the historical trend. And so we tested them, and we ended up with about 1,600 scenarios that we still wanted to continue with. And for those scenarios, we actually run them all through the MAGIC model, this is a small climate model, to see what the climate outcome would be. And that was possible for 1,200 scenarios, because you simply have to have that emission information to be able to do this. And all those scenarios then, in the end, there's 1,200, were classified based on their climate outcomes. And so we have the C1 category, which are scenarios that are consistent with more or less staying below 1.5 degrees. We have a C2 category that in the end also comes back to 1.5 degrees, but does so with some form of overshoot. We have the C3 scenarios that are likely to stay greater than 66% below 2 degrees, which could be maybe equated with the formulation of well below 2 degrees from the Paris Agreement. Then we have the C4 category that has a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees, and the higher categories. And so all the scenarios were classified. Yeah, so here you see them. Elena showed us a graph earlier. You see the temperature outcomes of these scenarios, but maybe it's more interesting to look at the emissions that are associated with these classes. And we can already note a few things. One thing is that if you compare the scenarios compared to AR5, then the high end has become less likely. And there are also less scenarios that now explore very high emissions, which can be understood. But there are changes, for instance, in terms of the cost of renewable energy that makes the very high scenarios less likely. In the short term, we also see a more narrow funnel. The baseline scenarios are lower than before, partly because of emerging climate policies. The mitigation scenarios are clearly higher than AR in the short term than those in AR5, but simply because some of the trajectories cannot be achieved anymore. Also, the 1.5 degree scenarios in the AR5, we still had scenarios that could remain quite a bit below 1.5 degree scenarios. 1.5 degree, we don't see those anymore. We're so close to 1.5 that even the best scenarios have some small overshoot. And then what we also saw in the literature is that there is a reduction of the net negative emissions that scenarios have, not necessarily the gross emissions, the gross negative emissions, but given the critique, given the suggestions that we might don't want to go as net negative as some of the older scenarios, you see a response in the literature. So yeah, this is another summary of the scenario outcomes. And here, and this graph is also shown earlier by Elena, I'm just showing all the scenarios that are classified as current policy in the literature and compare them with the C1 and C2 categories. And the C1 is the 1.5 and the C3 is the likely below 2 category. And the current policy scenarios, those are scenarios that are either going for the NDCs and then extended, or are exploring exactly the current policies as going to be currently implemented in countries. And so what do we see? First of all, that the current policy scenarios are leading to a temperature increase of around 2.2 to 3.5 degrees in 2100. Now that's by itself already some small positive news, because that's lower than we had before for current policy scenarios. Then we see that for the 1.5 degree target, the emissions need to peak before 2025. They need to be almost halved by 2030, and they need to reach net zero around 2050 for CO2. For likely 2 degree scenarios, we see that they need to be at 2070 at net zero for CO2. But that is only true if emissions are reduced in the short term. If not, then that year becomes much earlier, because you start to eat up the budget much quicker, and then you need to be at net zero earlier. Interesting to note is that the net zero year is slightly later in the AR6 report than in the SR 1.5 report. And this is a consequence of having less net negative emission scenarios. And so many of the scenarios now try to avoid large amounts of net negative emissions. Therefore, they go down quite rapidly and then hover a bit above the zero line, which gives a slightly later net zero year. It's also important that not all 1.5 degree scenarios reach net zero GHG. Reaching net zero GHG is actually not leading to a stabilization of temperature, but to a decrease of temperature. And you can see that many of the scenarios do reach net zero GHG, but certainly not all. Some are even positive by the end of the future. So the last thing to note is that you can also compare the current policy scenarios and the well below 2 and 1.5 degree scenarios on the short term. And then you see this famous gap still between the current policies and the NDCs and these optimal scenarios towards climate goals. And those gaps are still quite large. For likely 2 degrees, it's in the order of 10 to 15 gigatons of CO2 in 2030. For 1.5 degrees, it's in the order of 20 to 25 gigatons. But that is not all, because there is also still a gap between implemented policies and the NDCs of also about 5 gigatons of CO2. And so there's a lot of work still to be done for the countries, and this is a major contribution from the IPCC to the global stocktake. Current policies are simply not enough to be consistent with these long-term climate goals. After that negative message, maybe an excursion into something that could be positive. And this is actually not from the IPCC report, although it's related to it. So in the IPCC report, we already concluded that there were so many net zero announcements by countries. More than 100 countries have now announced net zero. And it might be interesting to look into what that could mean. And here I've shown the analysis from the image model. It's again the current policies and the indices. Those are consistent with what I had on the previous graph, and the temperature that these lead to, which is exactly the same also in the previous graph, at around 2.5 to 3.5 degrees warming. And if you just believe that all countries are honest, and countries that have now announced net zero targets, that they will actually implement them, and they will implement them from their NDC values onwards, linearly, then this would be the consequence. You see a major reduction in emissions, and interestingly, that would lead to a temperature outcome by the end of the century of around 2 degrees. This is also published by Malte Meinshausen earlier this year in Nature Climate Change. If you would make a next step and would say, okay, why wait until 2030 with strengthening policies? If you're going to net zero anyway, you might as well align your net zero, your NDC target with net zero. Then that would also already make a big difference. So we would another 0.2 degrees of warming could be avoided. And if we then, as the last step, assumed, okay, now 110 countries have announced net zero, let's assume that for the other 100 countries, we also take a net zero target. And we do so based on their socioeconomic circumstances. So we look at what the countries with similar socioeconomic circumstances have announced, and we then broaden that to all countries in the world. Actually, if that would be implemented, we would end up with a warming of around 1.6, 1.7 degrees by the end of the century. So getting closer to what you could see as well below 2. And so there is some hope in those net zero announcements that we have, that we are making progress, at least if countries are implementing them. Back to the IPCC report. And so many of the scenarios that are reaching the net zero targets in the 1.5 degree are these standard scenarios that seen in the literature quite a bit, which is they reduce emissions from fossil CO2 quite rapidly. They also reduce some of the non-CO2 emissions, but there are some hard to abate sectors that still remain. And therefore, there's also this negative emissions trying to offset the remaining fossil CO2 emissions. That's shown here. And so these scenarios go net negative. They also use CDR actually earlier to reach net zero CO2 and also to go down rapidly in the short term. Now, with the IMPs, we try to illustrate that there are also other pathways possible. And so we selected from that database a couple of scenarios that were illustrative for specific responses, and that's shown on the right. And so we have that category of scenarios that reach net zero while still having some positive CO2 emissions and also the non-CO2 emissions, and then being compensated by negative emissions, for instance, by BECCS or CDR. But then you also have scenarios that try to focus much more on renewable energy and go much lower on the remaining CO2 emissions, and therefore potentially also need much less compensation. And there are also scenarios that rely much more on lifestyle change, and therefore also go even lower on the CO2 emissions, but also reduce the non-CO2 gases much more, especially by diet change and going to lower meat or no meat diets. And again, that opens up the pathway to even less use of CDR measures, and specifically BECCS and DAC. So we used in the report these IMPs to illustrate different strategies. Yeah, so one important step that is now absolutely important in research, which is to make sure that the global analysis and the national analysis align very well. And so we have a couple of projects also sponsored under the Horizon program, where global models are collaborating with teams from countries around the world to improve insights. And this can go two ways. First of all, to help national teams maybe to think about reasonable targets for their country, and to for the global teams to learn from the specific circumstances in countries. And one very important thing to notice is that while globally we have to reach net zero CO2 at around 2050 to reach 1.5, that doesn't mean that all sectors and all countries have to do that. And we're giving the differences in historical responsibility, capability. It's quite logical to assume that some countries might be later, but that also means that some other countries need to be sooner than 2050 to reach the global average. And the same for sectors. And I think that discussion about responsibility and differentiation is a very important one to do justice in the climate debate. My last two slides is so first of all, I would like to say a bit on the current situation, and finally also some implications for IM research and energy system modeling research. And so first of all, when the IPC report was approved, the war in Europe had already started, and obviously there has this has made multiple implications. Energy security has become a much more important issue. High energy prices, high inflation, increased poverty, and geopolitical concerns. Timmermans had commented in this context by saying that the Green Deal might be even more important now than it was in the past. And I think all of us realize that he is right, that in the long term, the increased use of renewables and efficiency that is also part of most climate strategy scenarios have major benefits for energy security, certainly in Europe. In the short term, however, we have two possible responses. One is that we would indeed realize this and accelerate the energy transition, but we also might risk that there's a decreased support for the energy transition, given all the other priorities that are now playing. I think there were some presentations already at the conference trying to explore these different consequences. The current response of this year is probably more or less carbon neutral. While we have seen some emphasis on coal, at the same time there's much less natural gas use, mostly maybe via behavior change. So that's more or less neutral. Maybe the most threatening part is the long-term LNG contracts, which would potentially lock down Europe into long-term natural gas use. So there they it's important to realize how long do you still want to remain in natural gas. But it has possibly also strong consequences for our long-term scenarios. Almost all the analysis at the moment has been done for SSP2. Some teams look into SSP1, but does it mean that we might have to look much more into conflicting scenarios like SSP3? Do we have to spend more time on energy markets and what the current energy markets mean for mitigation? Do we have to think a bit more, even more on international collaboration and whether our assumptions of reasonably benign situations for climate policy are correct? What does the inflation mean maybe for mitigation analysis? I think there are important things that we have to look into. Now, maybe broaden that a bit. I would like to end with the challenges to model analysis in general, and that's actually a bit inspired by that power that the models have at the moment in the IPC report. So first of all, most of the model runs come from a limited set of models. You can see that on the right, which is in principle nice that these models have been able to contribute so much to the IPC research, and I think that's really important. At the same time, it means that there's not a really well geographical representation, and most of the teams do come from Europe, and I think it is really important that we make sure that there's much more contribution also from Asian, American, both North and South, and African teams to the IPC database. The second thing is that we often are working with scenarios that are at least a couple of years old. It's not so easy to update scenarios, but maybe that given the increasing emphasis now on climate policies, that is not possible anymore, and we have to find ways to update our scenarios more often. We often take care of feasibility concerns in terms of economic and technical constraints, but we do much less so in terms of governance constraints or socioeconomic constraints. And given the fact that the scenarios are used, it might be important to see how we can better account for them, because we might be suggesting pathways that are even not really possible in reality. The fourth thing that I think, need to realize more is that with the COVID situation and also now the situation with the war in Europe, deep uncertainty has increased. And so on the one hand, it would mean that scenarios are maybe more needed than ever. But then are these big IAMs the right tools to do so? Because, and especially collaborative projects, because that also takes time. So that might be a fourth dilemma. The fifth one is that we might analyze the database a bit better and to find out what is actually robust and what is model characteristics. I think that's an important thing, and that Work Group 1 does that already much better than we do. And finally, who determines which scenarios are run? If I now give lectures in my at university, many of the students would ask, why is there not a degrowth scenario? On the other hand, in the literature, you now see also quite some discussion about why IAMs are not looking into SRM, solar radiation management. Now, we as scientists probably have ideas about what we would like to be researching, and which is normal in a normal situation where as scientists, you can make your own choices about where your research focus on. But if, to some degree, the scenarios also form a portal for the futures that are discussed in the negotiations, then you might ask the question, how can we maybe make that choice a bit more democratic? These are the things that I wanted to share with you, and I would like to give the words back to Johan.
Great, thanks a lot, Detlef. Thanks for the very comprehensive insight also on especially the role of scenarios and models for the IPCC. And I think a lot of key messages and relevant findings, especially also for all the climate and energy modelers and modeling teams out there. Of course, we have a European focus as well, but there are also others here. Yeah, so now I think maybe we can have a few questions in case there are any on these the 3 lectures coming really from the, as you said, fresh in the press IPCC report. I'm sure there are a lot of questions and comments to it, but yes, in case you have some, please put them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, I think, and in case we can discuss this in person. Yeah, while you're saying maybe it's a typing one, I think main finding from taking them together was the role of policies, that policies can work, they don't always work, we saw it on innovation, but also the role of national policies that you highlight, that really, I think this is also for Policy Magazine. The finding is there, but then also, I mean, it needs to be implemented in many cases in national policies. So I think this link is really, and this is one of the that we really want to make in the ECMP. That was one of the main motivations, and also in this year's edition, to link global findings and national policies. So yeah, there's a question from Mark, whether you have a gut feeling, I don't know to whom, maybe to you or any of the 3. Yeah, of the role of inflation. If yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
can maybe see it there.
Although so inflation will have for sure also consequences for interest rates, and yeah, so some of the mitigation options, in general, the mitigation options are much more capital intensive than the fossil alternatives. And so here we would see that there will be a consequence simply for the costs that are perceived by, and certainly in developing countries, for mitigation options, would make mitigation slightly more difficult. Yeah, you could also potentially see it in your considerations with respect to the long-term goals, but I think that, yeah, that would be less important. But yeah, certainly in the short term, you might expect quite some different opinions on how you perceive the more capital-intensive mitigation options.
Yeah, agree. That's of course one of the big, maybe probably question that's that this different price changes can have, including on technologies. So
Johannes, can I also
yes.
make a follow-up comment to that, if I may? I think that the other side, I mean, another interesting question, a follow-up question to this is what would happen to the climate mitigation benefits with inflation this high as well. So it's not only, I mean, I think, of course, this is a community of modelers, so I understand that the question is about the models, and I understand why, but there's also another aspect, which is in many countries in the world, you know, we're trying to sort of, let me put it this way, sell climate mitigation as a way to achieve multiple societal goals. And so higher inflation, as well as other mega trends, you know, combating this would make it harder to achieve the societal goals, right? So I think that the question should be asked, but it should not stop at the models. I think it should go beyond the models and sort of like having a look at what it would also do for the quality of life, just transition, sustainable development. I think that Leif also mentioned this in passing, if I'm not mistaken, but the point is it will cripple, I mean, it will make it harder for us to let's say, achieve not only mitigation, but the other things that we want to come with mitigation, right?
Yes, that's perfect sense. I mean, maybe it's also a good bridge to the final speaker of today. So maybe we can, let's say, finish the presentations and then have a broader discussion. And because this is exactly the role of sustainable development and linkages across different impact parts, sustainability, biodiversity, etc. So our next speaker is Eva Brkic. I hope everyone said right. She's a program officer for sustainable energy at the UNECE, which is the, as you probably know, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and focused on things like the nexus of energy, climate, water, and other issues, with of course a specific focus on Europe. So I think very relevant to this discussion, especially within the European context. So we are very happy that she accepted to give her a keynote here in this plenary. So Eva, I think the floor is yours. If you have a presentation, I think you have. Yes.
Yes, I do have a couple of slides. Thank you so much for introduction and for inviting us. Today, I'm actually in the capacity of two teams. One is our Sustainable Energy Division, and I would like to present to you our work on carbon neutrality, where we use some climate and energy modeling from EASA. I know that later in the afternoon, there will be speakers from EASA, and I hope that then some dots will be connected as well. And also, as Johannes just said, our work on water and energy. I will also share some analysis that we have done and some tools that we developed here at the UNECE from our environment division. I'm personally part of the Sustainable Energy Division, and that's why I would also like to start with our work at UNECE that focuses on energy. I hope now you can all see my slides. So we recently launched our UNECE Carbon Neutrality Toolkit, and everything that we have heard this morning is actually putting into play the data and the models, the results, to really have this informed discussion with policymakers when developing the national plans and strategies to get to net zero. So under this project, we looked at, we assessed the technology and policy options for our region. UNECE region comprises North America, Europe, and Central Asia. And we asked ourselves, what are those technology and policy options that will get us to the destination? So this project and the toolkit actually consists of a number of technology deep dives. We learned through our consultation process with member states about 2 years ago that there are some gaps in understanding and of what are really potential of all of zero carbon technologies to get to the net zero. So we did an extensive exercise with policymakers to really zoom in and better understand some technologies. And then under the concept of carbon neutrality, we really put it into play and developed also those two publications that you can see on the right-hand side. This is a familiar graph. We have already seen it a couple of times this morning, but this was basically our starting point. We tailored it for our region, for the UNECE region, and we first ask ourselves, okay, how big is the gap? How can we get to net zero? And we're talking about 90 gigatons of CO2 emissions that need to be extracted by captured by 2050 across our region to get to net zero. So we learned that there are obvious achievable pathways for governments to design and achieve carbon neutral energy systems. And this will happen through the technology interplay of low and zero carbon technologies. So most of you must be already familiar with the approach that is taken for, under the message EASA project model. So we apply the climate and energy modeling as a tool for informed decision making with our stakeholders, with our member states. And while implementing the project, we worked with EASA. We recalibrated and adapted slightly the message model to our region. We worked very closely with the member states across the region, and I can only echo what the colleague before just mentioned, that it was really important to look again at the assumptions, especially when we look at the eastern part of our region or Central Asia. We really had to take a deeper dive to strengthen those assumptions and make our modeling results more robust. So the modeling obviously entails numerous assumptions, and I will not go into this, but for us, actually, when we worked with our policy, with our stakeholders, with our policy makers, they really wanted to understand, okay, how these actually models work. Now, I'll not stay long on this slide, but I will actually tell you maybe a little bit more. This might be interesting for this audience. What are actually those scenarios that we developed and tailored for our work? We actually had 3 main scenarios and a number of technology deep dives. First was the reference scenario, which was the SSP2 scenario, which is similar, and we, I think today in the chat there was already some exchange about this. So this was our so-called business as usual or reference scenario. The second 2 scenarios are, I think, more interesting and a little bit special and tailored for this particular work. The one on carbon neutrality, which was a normative scenario, really where we try to get an answer, okay, how we get to net zero by 2050. Then, if you recall, we did a couple of technology deep dives, and our stakeholders were actually curious what actually happens with our scenarios or our carbon neutrality scenario if we give a little bit more nudge to some specific technologies. So we worked together with the team from YASA, and we strengthened a little bit the potential of hydrogen, CCUS, and the next generation of nuclear power as having a role to get to net zero. And based on that, these additional special technology deep dives, we pulled a so-called carbon neutrality innovation scenario, which really looked at all the 3 deep dives combined and measured the synergies between them and benefits. So in a nutshell, those are like really the 3 main, I would say, key scenarios with, of course, the technology deep dives that were also they're also now available. So for our audience, when we were then pulling the data out and trying to develop really a roadmap for our region to get to net zero, we highlighted that actually the future energy system, it will be the future carbon neutral energy system, is really based on an integrated approach where there is an interplay of low and zero carbon technologies and distributed energy resources. And the different sectors as part of this energy system are really interconnected and they communicate with each other. So we wanted really then to understand, okay, what's the really contribution of each technology and by how much we need to really cut CO2 emissions across different sectors to get to our destination. So from this slide, you can see that we did like some specific zoom-ins on specific sectors, and we also assessed the contribution of some specific technologies. Now I would like to just share some results from our latest study on technology interplay under the carbon neutrality concept. This study was launched about 2 weeks ago. It's also fresh from the press. And actually, it will create a foundation for our additional work that will follow from this one onwards. We will take some specific deep dives on applying these concepts and ideas when attaining carbon neutrality in Central Asia, in the Caucasus. And we also recently got a request from Ukraine thinking how we can help Ukraine to rebuild their energy system under the applying those concepts of carbon neutrality and net zero when hopefully soon time is ripe to do so. So these are some national-based and regional-based additional analysis that we will be conducting in the course of next 6 months. Now, we obviously we ask ourselves also the question, okay, how much this energy transition will actually cost? And this slide really shows the investment needs across the region to get to net zero, comparison of the reference and our carbon neutrality scenario. The cost is about more than 1.5 times higher for our region to get to net zero. And the message, obviously, as you all highlighted also before, is that there is really the greatest cost is like if there is no inaction. And the message that we try to constantly highlight to our stakeholders is that we should not perceive those actions to secure energy transition as a cost, but actually these so-called costs today are rather investments for the future. And this highlighting the urgency is also language that we try to communicate while bringing along not only our member states, but also a wider stakeholder community. Now, for our region, also for UNEC, so again, it's North America, Europe, and Central Asia clustered. We ask ourselves, okay, how the future energy system would look like, and this slide really shows comparison of the final energy mix in reference and carbon neutrality scenario. So we notice that there are really like structural changes in the final energy mix, really on the back of the deep low carbon electrification and energy savings. But another message that we really wanted to highlight and communicate in conducting this research, and now with trying to mobilizing our member states also in preparation for COP27, is that there really is about innovation and resource diversification, so that these approaches will be really at the core of creating a resilient and future energy system that delivers on energy security, affordability, and environmental sustainability. So as I said, we looked at a couple of sectors. Here, there's a scenario comparison of the industry sector. We notice like greater savings thanks to improved industrial energy efficiencies, and quite some penetration from hydrogen and electricity, great portion share of electricity in the scenarios with higher climate mitigation efforts. The building sector also will experience some structural changes, greater savings, deeper electrification of the building sector, and it's interesting to observe that in an innovation sector scenario, we see some quite some presence expected of hydrogen for heating, because this scenario actually builds on greater, more positive assumptions that support hydrogen economy and deployment of hydrogen projects across this sector. Finally, the third scenario we assessed was the transport scenario. Here, again, quite some structural changes observed, greater efficiencies, deeper also electrification of the transport sector, and the role of bioliquids and hydrogen in our innovation scenario is more prominent and robust. Now, I would like to move to the second set of tools that we developed at UNECE with our colleagues from Environment Division. UNECE Environment is actually hosting, not only hosting, actually developed the water conventions. So these are really the UN global instruments that to support provide the legal institutional framework for the transboundary water cooperation. And under the scope of this work, there are really many different areas of work, which include, of course, climate change adaptation, and what we mentioned also before, the nexus between water, food or land, and energy ecosystem. So these both areas of works have directed the scope for 2022 and 2024, and there is a dedicated task force of country representatives, river basin organizations, experts and practitioners. This task force is open, so if some of you colleagues would like to be involved, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Some interesting meetings are already lined up and planned for later this year. So here, apologies, I would like to introduce to you a methodology that provides the so-called intersectoral assessment at transboundary level, which is informed really by analysis and integrated energy and climate modeling. And main characteristics of this work is that it really adapts to the context and the specifics of each basin. So it looks at a number of criteria like relevant boundaries and scales, be they geographical, physical, or based on governance. It looks at existing models, data availability, and data gaps, where data or assumptions need to be more strengthened. And the task force here helps in strengthening this work. It looks, of course, at existing legal institutional frameworks and some past experiences, like what are the lessons learned, what can be adapted, and as well as existing strategies, policies, and action plans and programs that are present on the micro level, but also how is it all connected in developing the basin work. So the Water Convention work supported analytical water energy land nexus work in various basins, not only across UNEC region. Of course, our region is in the focus, but the work of that task force and the project has also contributed in shaping many initiatives that are really across other basins in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So we here the focus on modeling is always on water energy in the context of climate change for really better planning of climate change adaptation and mitigation. And in most cases, as I said, main focus really is on water and energy modeling and hydropower. But it's not really only on the UNEC region. I wanted to highlight here that the team also looked at the case of Northwest Sahara Aquifer System, and the main focus was here on actually agriculture use and water and energy. So here I would like to zoom in on some relatively recent work, but it has been already a big project for a couple of years now that's looked at the Western Balkans region, and several really projects have been implemented in the course of past decade that really involved local authorities and experts across the sectors. So really about from energy, water, and environment. And most recently, project focused on the Drin and Drina river basins and involved here the water and energy modeling from KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. So the work was really coordinated with local institutional research institute, and the modeling approach took really this technology and economic approach, was financed by the Austrian Development Agency and Global Water Partnership Mediterranean. So it's really one of those flagship projects that were findings we still disseminate, and we still work very closely with the stakeholders from the region and project beneficiary countries. Finally, There is also an interesting publication which was actually developed between the UNECE Sustainable Energy Division and Environment Division. We looked at really role of renewable energy and impact on the water and energy nexus. A toolkit is now available. It was really tailored for the energy policymakers to deploy renewable energy across and make really the work in across the transboundary water basins more sustainable. So it was the key quote really from the takeaways is that energy really related objectives can be more achieved more effectively through an integrated approach, through consultative planning. There are synergies across environmental, energy, and other sector objectives. So the tools developed under this work have been now also applied not only on our water and energy nexus work, but also in our work when looking at renewable energy and role of hydropower in getting to the net zero or decarbonizing the energy systems across the region. So with that, I would like to thank you. There are some additional tools. I believe maybe presentations will be shared by the organizers with everybody. So I encourage you to maybe look deeper and read, help us also disseminate some of those products. And in case of any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on Carbon Neutrality Project and to my colleague Lucia Destrasser on Water and Energy Nexus. With that, I will stop sharing and back to you, Johannes, in case of some questions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Eva. Perfectly also on time and for a very broad overview on two important topics, which I think are very much related to the scope of this conference and this session. One on the net neutrality, and secondly, also then at the more local focus, both in terms of focusing on Europe at all the European region, and then also even at subnational policies, and also I think a nice example of how energy policies, energy modeling also interacts with other domains, including water and other sustainable goals. Also very interesting. Yes, well, thanks to all speakers of today. I think it was really a very relevant session with a lot of connection points, and we had a very big hydrogen session, for instance, yesterday. I think a lot of research for which this is very relevant. So we have around 15 minutes before lunch. So yeah, I know this is a long session, but I think a very relevant, interesting one. So I hope it's worth your time. Yeah, so we have, please put questions in the chat if you have any.
There is one question, and I would be happy to pick it up with a little disclaimer. There was a question from Youssef Almula on how are we applying a message model also in our Nexus work. That is a question, a big question, and we have had like a bit of headache, and we still haven't really found a solution. We are exploring it. The Water and Energy Food Nexus applied the KTH modeling, not message modeling. We used message modeling for our carbon neutrality project, and before that for our pathways, so-called pathways to sustainable energy project. But we do use the results from the message model and our work on carbon neutrality to inform to what extent the penetration of renewable energy, such as solar, wind, but also hydro. And for Central Asia, for instance, Central Asian countries and some Caucasus countries, we really see here greater and greater role of hydro. Then these results inform our colleagues that work on Nexus, and we didn't have a chance to go now to the next stage, which would maybe look like deeper into how to bring those models together. But we were thinking about it. We are also raising funds. There is certainly interest from member states to do more. on these topics. And maybe just to do a little bit of marketing, we are going to Central Asia, to Almaty, mid of next month. There will be Almaty Energy Forum from the 14th until the 16th of November, where we will be actually talking about these specific questions and how we marry the two for the countries in Central Asia. So carbon neutrality and water energy nexus will be the key themes of our Almaty Energy Forum mid of November this year. So Yusuf, please join us and everybody else.
Yes, great. I think there are a lot of initiatives such as this, which are very relevant, and certainly for many researchers or policy makers in this forum can be relevant. So happy to, if you can share also a link or on some of the reports in the chat, I think that's also.
Oh yeah,
great.
I can do that, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, KTH also is actually the coordinator of the project ECMF organizing this workshop. So when they do a lot of work with similar on the modeling part that you've been using. So already there's a lot of models also to the IPCC people and institutions linking across different realms, which is important. So, and it's also great to see this bring together in meetings like such as this one. So yes. I think it was a long set of presentations with a lot of food for thought. But yes, so as you know, this is the last day of this ECMP. So we're going to have our last parallel set of sessions today in the afternoon at 2 until 3:30. After which short coffee break at 3:45. We will have our closing plenary, which for the ECMP I think is nice because it's not the usual 15 minutes closure, but it's a bit longer. It's 1 hour and 15 minutes. So it's really the idea to have a discussion on this conference on interesting topics. What are the topics to be set for next year's one, coming from policymakers, but also from the modeling teams, researchers, discussing on what should be next year's conference topic. What are the key highlights? Innovation was one that was really found important last year, and we tried to take this up this year. So it's really an opportunity, I think, to see and voice your opinion on what is important in research-wise, policy-wise. So we really hope for lively discussion. So this will be in the afternoon, starting 3:45 until 5. So if you can connect, please do so. We really hope to see you there as well. For then also taking the final group picture of everyone. And so maybe we can just start early, and after the food for thought, having the food for also the body, which I think is important as well, as also Eva mentioned in your talk actually. So thanks for the links, and well, thanks again for especially the speakers for being with us today. And so the video of this conference, including presentations, which are in the video, will be made available on the website relatively soon. And thanks again for especially the speakers, everyone to stay here. Enjoy your lunch break, and see you soon at 2 for panel sessions, and hopefully at around 4 for the closing of this year's ECMP. Okay, great. Thanks again, and enjoy your lunch, and see you next time. And thanks especially to the speakers. Thank you all. See you later.